blizzard that struck Barrow Junction on Christmas Eve 2015 brought more than snow. It brought Mordecai Blackthorne. Barnabas Grimshaw first noticed the stranger 3 blocks from his workshop, trudging through knee-deep drifts with the determined gait of someone who understood Alaska's unforgiving nature. At 54, Barney had developed an instinct for reading people, and something about this man's purposeful stride through the storm struck him as odd. "Another stray looking for work," Dolores observed from their kitchen window, wrapping her hands around a steaming coffee mug. After 28 years of marriage, she knew her husband's routines better than he did. "You going to offer him shelter?" Barney watched the figure disappear behind the Thornfield house. Reggie mentioned they hired someone new at the cooperative, probably him. Christmas morning arrived with deceptive tranquility. The storm had passed, leaving Barrow Junction crystalline and pristine under 3 feet of snow. Barney was adjusting the carburetor on old Henrik's snowmobile when Dolores called from the house, her voice carrying an unfamiliar tension. "Barney, you need to come in. Eleanor's on the phone. Says her grandmother's cameo is missing." The first theft seemed insignificant. Eleanor Ashworth was 73 and occasionally misplaced things. But when Harold Wickham reported his father's pocket watch missing later that day, followed by Sarah Montrose, discovering her late husband's military medals had vanished, the pattern became undeniable. "Never had anything like this," Mayor Cunningham muttered during the emergency meeting that evening. The community center felt smaller with everyone packed inside, breath visible in small clouds despite the heating. 40 years I've lived here, and nobody's ever stolen so much as a candy bar." Barney noticed Mordecai sitting quietly in the back, taking notes like a concerned citizen. The man had introduced himself earlier as an experienced industrial mechanic, soft-spoken and respectful, asking intelligent questions about winter survival and community customs. Nothing overtly suspicious, yet something about his presence nagged at Barney like a splinter beneath the skin. "Whoever's doing this has access," declared Eleanor, her voice sharp with indignation. "These aren't random break-ins. They knew exactly where to look. My cameo was in my jewelry box. Harold's watch was in his bedroom dresser. Sarah's medals were in her study." Eyes began turning toward Barney. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, the subtle shift in posture that signaled changing allegiances. As the town's primary repair technician, he had legitimate access to nearly every home in Barrow Junction. Furnace repairs, generator maintenance, emergency calls. His work took him into the most private spaces of people's lives. "Now hold on," his cousin Reggie interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. "Barney's helped every family here. He wouldn't... I've never stolen anything in my life," Barney said quietly, but the damage was already done. Suspicion, once planted, grew like ice crystals, slowly at first, then with inexorable persistence. The search of his property came 2 days later. Barney watched neighbors he'd known for decades rifle through his possessions with clinical thoroughness, their faces masks of uncomfortable duty. They found nothing in the house, but the workshop yielded a canvas bag hidden behind old equipment, a bag containing every stolen item, plus several others no one had yet reported missing. "I've never seen this before," Barney whispered, staring at the evidence that would destroy his reputation. But his protest sounded hollow, even to himself. The placement was too convenient, the discovery too perfect. Someone had orchestrated this with surgical precision. The isolation that followed felt like suffocation. Barney found himself confined to his house while the town council deliberated, watching former friends cross streets to avoid his property. Dolores stood by him publicly, but he caught her studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, doubt creeping into her eyes like frost forming on windows. "The kids called," she said on the 3rd day, her voice carefully neutral. "News travels fast in Alaska. They want to know if they should come home." The thought of his adult children learning about these accusations made Barney's chest tighten. 3 generations of Grimshaw integrity reduced to whispered gossip about a desperate man stealing from his neighbors. But as the hours crawled by, patterns began emerging that troubled him more than his own predicament. The thefts had started immediately after Mordecai's arrival, yet the newcomer seemed to navigate their community's complex social dynamics with unusual skill. He knew which families had valuable heirlooms, understood the layout of homes he'd supposedly never entered, asked questions that seemed innocent, but probed for specific information. During his 3rd sleepless night, Barney made a decision that would either vindicate him or destroy what remained of his reputation. If someone had framed him with such meticulous planning, they would have made other preparations. Evidence would exist, hidden but findable if you knew where to look. The temperature had dropped to 38 below when Barney slipped out through his workshop's rear exit. The aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, providing just enough illumination to navigate the snow-covered streets without a flashlight. The cooperative building stood silent against the stars, its darkened windows reflecting the dancing northern lights. Mordecai's apartment above the processing floor was accessible through an exterior staircase Barney had helped construct years earlier. He knew every weakness in the building's security, including the simple lock on the apartment door. A lock designed to keep out curious teenagers, not determined investigators. Inside, the apartment felt wrong in ways Barney couldn't immediately articulate. Too sterile, too organized, like a carefully constructed facade rather than a living space. The furniture was arranged with geometric precision, personal items positioned as if for display rather than use. In the bedroom closet, beneath a floorboard that creaked when he stepped on it, Barney discovered a metal strongbox. Inside were horrors that made his blood freeze despite the apartment's warmth. Detailed surveillance notes about every family in Barrow Junction, photographs taken through windows, copies of keys he must have made while visiting homes under legitimate pretenses. But the laptop computer contained revelations that transformed his understanding of what they were facing. File after file documented similar operations in isolated communities across North America. Villages where Mordecai had systematically destroyed social bonds through carefully orchestrated campaigns of suspicion and mistrust. The methodology was sophisticated and terrifying. Phase 1, arrival during community celebrations when newcomers were welcomed without extensive background checks. Phase 2, establishing legitimate access to homes through employment or volunteer work. Phase 3, psychological profiling to identify the perfect scapegoat, someone trusted enough to have access, isolated enough to lack strong defenders. Phase 4, evidence placement and community manipulation. Each campaign concluded with detailed analysis of results. How quickly trust eroded, which social bonds proved most vulnerable, how long communities took to recover, if they recovered at all. Some villages had simply dissolved, their populations scattering to other towns when the fabric of mutual support became too damaged to sustain life in harsh environments. Barney photographed everything with trembling hands, understanding now that he hadn't been chosen randomly. He was the ideal target in an engineered social experiment designed to destroy everything his community had built over generations. Armed with evidence, Barney faced an impossible dilemma. The proof of his innocence existed, but obtaining it required breaking into Mordecai's apartment, an act that would invalidate everything he discovered in the eyes of the law and his community. Worse, he realized that confronting Mordecai directly might prompt the man to disappear, leaving Barney forever branded as a thief. Instead, he chose a more dangerous path. He would have to expose Mordecai's true nature while the predator believed himself safe, unaware that his carefully constructed web was unraveling. The next morning, Barney requested a meeting with the town council, ostensibly to provide additional testimony in his own defense. In the community center, facing the same neighbors who had searched his property and found him wanting, he began laying his trap. "I've been thinking about the timing," he said slowly, his voice carrying just enough uncertainty to avoid seeming rehearsed. "The thefts started right after Christmas Eve, but they stopped after you found that bag in my workshop. If I was really the thief, why would I stop stealing just because I hadn't been caught yet?" Mayor Cunningham frowned. "What are you suggesting? Maybe whoever did this wanted you to find that evidence. Maybe the real thief is still among us, watching us tear ourselves apart." Barney let his gaze sweep the room, noting how Mordecai's expression remained perfectly neutral, while others shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor Ashworth spoke up from the front row. "You're saying someone framed you? Who would do such a thing?" "Someone who understands how our community works," Barney replied. "Someone who knew exactly which families had valuable items, who knew my work schedule well enough to time the thefts when I'd make a convenient suspect." He watched Mordecai's pale eyes flicker with what might have been amusement. The man was enjoying this, confident in his manipulation of the situation. That confidence would be his downfall. Over the following days, Barney began a careful campaign of observation and subtle questioning. He asked Dolores to mention during her shopping trips that they were considering installing a security system, something that would require reviewing everyone who'd had access to their home. He suggested to Reggie that the cooperative should conduct background checks on all employees, given the recent troubles. Mordecai's responses to these probes were perfectly crafted, concerned but not overly interested, supportive of additional security measures without seeming defensive. But Barney noticed other things: how the man's eyes tracked conversations about the investigation, how he positioned himself to overhear discussions about potential suspects, how he subtly steered conversations toward other possible culprits. The breakthrough came when Barney convinced Harold Wickham to stage a test. Harold announced publicly that he'd discovered another family heirloom missing, a silver letter opener that had belonged to his grandfather. But the letter opener was actually hidden in Barney's workshop, with Harold's full knowledge and cooperation. Within 24 hours, the stolen letter opener appeared in Barney's tool drawer, discovered during a follow-up search by the town council. The placement was too convenient, too obvious, and this time, Barney had witnesses to prove the item had been planted. The confrontation came during the council's emergency session to discuss the new evidence. Faced with proof that someone was actively framing Barney, the community's focus shifted to identifying who had the knowledge and access to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. "Whoever's doing this knows our routines, our homes, our relationships," Mayor Cunningham said grimly. "It has to be someone we trusted enough to let inside our lives." Mordecai made his fatal mistake then, speaking up with perfectly reasonable concern. "Maybe we should consider that the real culprit might be someone who's been planning this for months, studying our community before making his move." "His move?" Barney asked quietly. "Why do you assume it's a man?" The slip was minor, but in a room full of people looking for answers, it resonated. Eleanor had never specified the thief's gender. Neither had Harold or Sarah. The assumption revealed knowledge that an innocent observer wouldn't possess. What followed was the careful unraveling of Mordecai's deception. Under sustained questioning, small inconsistencies emerged in his story. His supposed references from previous jobs proved untraceable when contacted. His knowledge of local customs was too detailed for someone who'd arrived just days before Christmas. The search of Mordecai's apartment revealed the full scope of his operation: surveillance equipment, detailed psychological profiles of community members, and most damning, the remaining stolen items that hadn't yet been planted as evidence. The laptop contained his true masterpiece, a comprehensive study of social engineering techniques tested across dozens of isolated communities. But even with his guilt established, Mordecai's final revelation chilled everyone present. This hadn't been about theft or personal gain. It was the experiment in social destruction, funded by unnamed parties interested in understanding how isolated communities could be destabilized and controlled. "You people are case studies," he said with clinical detachment as the state troopers finally arrived to take him into custody. "Isolated populations, high interdependence, limited outside contact, perfect test subjects for understanding social collapse." The implications were terrifying. Barrow Junction hadn't been randomly selected. They'd been targeted as part of a larger research project into community manipulation. Other villages might be facing similar campaigns of psychological warfare, their social bonds systematically severed by operatives trained in human engineering. In the weeks that followed, Barney's reputation was formally restored, but the damage to the community proved more persistent. People apologized for doubting him, but the easy trust that had bound them together for generations had been wounded. They'd learned how quickly suspicion could replace faith, how fragile the bonds of mutual support actually were. The most troubling discovery came months later, when federal investigators revealed that Mordecai was part of a network studying social control techniques in isolated populations. The research had potential applications in everything from corporate management to military operations. Understanding how to break and rebuild human communities was apparently valuable knowledge to certain organizations. Barney found himself changed by the experience in ways that surprised him. The violation of being suspected by lifelong friends had left psychological scars, but it had also strengthened his appreciation for the bonds that ultimately saved him. Dolores had stood by him when doubt was easier. Reggie had questioned, but never abandoned him. The community had been manipulated, but it had also demonstrated resilience when confronted with truth. Standing in his workshop on the anniversary of that Christmas Eve, watching new snow fall on streets where neighbors once again visited each other freely, Barney reflected on the lessons learned. Evil could be sophisticated, patient, and scientifically precise in its methods. But communities built on genuine relationships, tested by fire and proven authentic, could survive attacks that would destroy groups held together only by convenience or proximity. The Christmas lights in their neighbors' windows seemed brighter now, more meaningful. They represented something Mordecai's research had failed to account for: the human capacity to rebuild trust after betrayal, to choose faith over fear, to value relationships more than safety. In the end, that had been the flaw in his perfect plan. He'd underestimated the very bonds he'd tried to destroy. The photographs from 1987 still haunt me, not because of what they show, but because of what they don't show, the evil that lurked just outside the frame. I'm Darius Whitmore, and at 67, I've spent decades trying to forget what I learned about trust, isolation, and the monsters that hide behind familiar faces in the Alaskan wilderness. In the spring of 1987, I was 32 and working as a wildlife photographer for National Geographic. My assignment was simple: document the Kodiak brown bears during salmon season on Kodiak Island, 6 months in Karluk Bay, a fishing settlement of 180 souls accessible only by float plane. My wife Eleanor and 8-year-old daughter were back in Seattle, counting the days until my return. I rented a room above Ezekiel Grimwald's general store, the heart of Karluk Bay's modest commercial district. Ezekiel was a weathered man in his 40s, married to Cordelia, with 2 grown sons who worked the fishing boats. The Grimwalds were generous hosts, treating me like family despite my outsider status. "You'll need a guide for the backcountry," Ezekiel told me over coffee on my 3rd morning. Bears are unpredictable this time of year. My brother Tobias knows these mountains better than anyone. Tobias Grimwald arrived that afternoon, a tall, bearded man of 45 with hands like tree roots and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He spoke little, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived decades in unforgiving wilderness. The townspeople clearly respected him. Verity Ashford, the settlement's nurse, mentioned how Tobias had guided numerous hunting parties safely through terrain that had claimed other lives. "I've been tracking these bears for 20 years, Tobias said, studying my camera equipment. "Know their patterns, their feeding grounds. You want the perfect shot? I'll get you there." Over the next 4 months, Tobias and I made 3 extended expeditions into the Kodiak backcountry. We'd pack provisions for a week, hike deep into valleys where no human footprints marked the earth, and set up camps near salmon streams where massive brown bears congregated. Tobias proved invaluable, anticipating weather changes, reading animal behavior, positioning us for spectacular photographs while maintaining safe distances. During those long evenings by the campfire, Tobias shared stories of the island's history, of shipwrecks and forgotten settlements, of people who'd vanished into the wilderness and were never found. He spoke matter-of-factly about death in Alaska, how the land claimed those who underestimated its power. "Had some backpackers come through last summer," he mentioned during our 2nd expedition. "Young women from the lower 48, hiking solo. Told them they were crazy. This country's no place for amateurs. Haven't seen them since. Probably got smart and caught the next plane out." I photographed him, sometimes this rugged guide who seemed to embody everything romantic about frontier Alaska. In those images, Tobias appears exactly as he was: competent, trustworthy, at home in the wilderness. There's nothing in his expression to suggest the darkness that lived behind those calculating eyes. Our final expedition in September yielded my best work. We tracked a massive boar bear to a remote salmon run, and I captured images of raw, predatory power that would later win awards. Tobias watched me work with what I thought was professional satisfaction, but I now recognize as something else entirely: the patient observation of a predator studying prey. I left Kodiak Island in October with hundreds of photographs and deep gratitude for Tobias's expertise. My National Geographic feature ran the following spring to considerable acclaim. I sent copies to the Grimwalds, including shots of Tobias himself, and received a kind letter from Cordelia saying how proud the family was to be featured in such a prestigious magazine. 7 years passed. I continued photographing wildlife across North America, building a reputation and providing well for my family. Kodiak became a cherished memory, a time when I'd pushed my artistic boundaries in one of Earth's last wild places, guided by a man who seemed to embody everything admirable about those who choose to live close to nature's edge. The phone call came on a gray March morning in 1994. Ezekiel's voice was barely recognizable, aged by shock and grief. "Darius, I don't know how to tell you this. They found bodies on Tobias's property. 2 women. The authorities think he killed them." the world tilted. I sat heavily in my kitchen chair, staring at family photographs while Ezekiel's words washed over me. Alaska State Troopers had received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity at Tobias's remote cabin. A search revealed human remains buried in various locations around the property. 2 women who'd been reported missing in 1988 and 1989. Their names were Imogen Blackthorne and Delphine Ravencroft. Young women who'd come to Alaska seeking adventure, drawn by the same wild beauty that had captivated me. The photographs I'd taken of Tobias suddenly acquired a sinister weight. I pulled them from my files with trembling hands, studying his face for signs I'd missed. How could I have spent weeks alone with a killer, sharing meals and stories around remote campfires? How had I failed to see the monster behind the mountain man facade? The investigation revealed horrifying details. Both women had been experienced hikers, but Alaska's vastness had made them vulnerable. Tobias had encountered them separately on backcountry trails, offering assistance and shelter. His remote cabin, the same one where he'd stored our expedition supplies, had become their prison. Forensic evidence suggested they'd been held captive for weeks before their deaths. I remembered his casual mention of the backpackers, how he dismissed their abilities with what I'd interpreted as protective concern. Now I understood it as something far darker, a predator's assessment of potential victims. Those women hadn't gotten smart and caught the next plane out. They trusted the wrong guide. The trial consumed me. I flew to Anchorage, sat in the courtroom, and watched Tobias shuffle in wearing orange jail clothing. Gone was the confident outdoorsman. In his place sat a diminished figure who refused to meet anyone's eyes. The prosecution presented evidence methodically: forensic findings, timeline reconstructions, testimony from other hikers who'd encountered Tobias in the backcountry. Verity Ashford testified about inconsistencies she'd noticed in Tobias's stories, times when his timeline of movements didn't align with reported sightings. Her 16-year-old daughter, Willa, had apparently expressed discomfort around Tobias, though Verity had dismissed it as teenage moodiness. Ezekiel testified reluctantly, his voice breaking as he described a brother he thought he'd known. The family was devastated, not just by Tobias's crimes, but by their complete failure to recognize his true nature. How do you reconcile 20 years of shared meals and holidays with the knowledge that your brother is a killer? Tobias eventually accepted a plea bargain, 30 years for 2 counts of manslaughter. He claimed the deaths weren't premeditated, that situations had escalated beyond his control. The victims' families protested the reduced charges, but prosecutors worried about proving premeditation in such remote circumstances. I attended the sentencing. When given the opportunity to speak, Tobias offered a brief apology that revealed nothing about his motivations. He expressed no real remorse, only regret at being caught. I realized then that I'd never actually known him at all, just the carefully constructed persona he'd presented to the world. The experience changed everything about how I approach my work and my life. I became more cautious in remote locations, more skeptical of strangers offering help. The wilderness that had once represented pure freedom now carried shadows of human predation. Every isolated cabin, every helpful local guide, every friendly stranger encountered on distant trails triggered memories of Tobias's patient smile. But the nightmare wasn't over. Last year, at age 66, I received another devastating phone call. Tobias had been released early due to prison overcrowding and good behavior, serving only 22 years of his sentence. Within months, a female park ranger named Celia Thornfield had vanished while conducting research near his old territory. Her body was found 6 weeks later. Evidence linked Tobias to her death, and he was arrested again, this time for first-degree murder. At 78, he'd apparently lost none of his predatory instincts. I'm sharing this story as a warning. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the face of competence and local knowledge, offering exactly the help you think you need. Tobias fooled an entire community for decades, presenting himself as the ideal wilderness guide while harboring monstrous intentions. I think constantly about those moments when I was alone with him, miles from any help, completely dependent on his expertise. What invisible calculation saved me while dooming Imogen and Delphine? Was it simply that I was a man, or that my high-profile assignment made me too risky a target? The photographs from that expedition remain in my files, but I've never displayed them. They serve as reminders that appearances deceive, that trust can be weaponized, and that some people are terrifyingly skilled at hiding their true nature. In Alaska's vast wilderness, where self-reliance and community trust are matters of survival, predators find perfect hunting grounds among those who mistake isolation for safety. Aldrich Thornfield had coordinated cruise ship arrivals in Whittier for 15 years, but he'd never encountered anyone quite like Gideon Ravencroft. The photographer appeared at the port in early June 2019, claiming to specialize in cruise tourism documentation. With his expensive camera equipment and professional demeanor, Gideon seemed legitimate enough. Whittier's unique geography, a town of 270 people where 3/4 lived in a single 14-story building, made everyone a neighbor whether they wanted to be or not. "Beautiful morning for the Norwegian Jewel's arrival," Gideon remarked, positioning himself near Aldrich's coordination station on the dock. His camera clicked steadily as passengers disembarked, but Aldrich noticed the lens often pointed toward him rather than the tourists. "Every morning's beautiful when you're keeping 2,000 passengers on schedule," Aldrich replied, checking his tablet for the next arrival. The Princess cruise ship would dock in 90 minutes, followed by the Holland America vessel at 4. Coordinating these maritime giants required precise timing and constant communication with ship captains, tour operators, and ground transportation. Gideon became a fixture at the port over the following weeks. He claimed to be documenting Alaska's cruise industry for a Seattle-based magazine, though he never showed official press credentials. What disturbed Aldrich was Gideon's uncanny knowledge of details he shouldn't have possessed. "Your wife Cordelia runs the gift shop beautifully," Gideon mentioned during a brief conversation, his pale eyes never leaving Aldrich's face. 28 years of marriage must create such intimate routines. I imagine she still makes that herbal tea you love every evening at 9:15, just like she did when you first moved to apartment 14C. Aldrich's blood froze. The specific apartment number, the tea ritual, these were private details known only to close friends. "How could you possibly know that?" Gideon's smile stretched wider, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "I make it my business to understand the people I work with, Aldrich. Understanding creates connection." The word connection lingered in the air like a threat. Aldrich began paying closer attention to Gideon's movements, noting how the photographer positioned himself to overhear radio communications, how he lingered near restricted areas with his camera always ready. The harassment escalated systematically. Aldrich's keycard was duplicated, allowing someone after-hours access to fuel docks and cargo bays. Security footage revealed a figure moving through the facility at midnight, but the cameras captured only shadows and deliberately obscured angles. Then came the drone, a small aircraft hovering outside Baggage Tower's windows, recording the intimate details of residents' private lives. "Someone's been learning our entire operation," Nestor Blackthorne, the harbor master, reported grimly. "Not stealing, just mapping everything, like they're planning something." The direct confrontation came on a foggy Tuesday evening. Aldrich worked late processing manifest changes for the next day's arrivals when footsteps echoed through the empty port facility. Gideon emerged from the shadows near the fuel storage area, no longer carrying his camera. "Working alone again, Aldrich?" Gideon's voice carried a different quality now, hungrier, more focused. "Such dedication to duty. It reminds me of Harbor Coordinator Davies in Juneau. He worked late too, until I helped him understand his true purpose." "What do you want?" Aldrich demanded, his hand moving toward the emergency radio. "Want?" Gideon laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I want to complete what we've started. You've been so perfect, Aldrich, so predictable. Every routine documented, every vulnerability cataloged. Your wife, your home, your beautiful isolation here in this concrete tower. It's all exactly what I need." Gideon pulled out a tablet, swiping through hundreds of photos. Aldrich at work, Cordelia in their apartment, intimate moments stolen through hidden cameras. "I've been building our relationship for months. Now it's time to make it permanent." Aldrich's hand closed around the emergency radio, but Gideon moved with surprising speed, knocking it from his grip. The device clattered across the concrete dock, its red light blinking uselessly in the growing darkness. "No interruptions," Gideon whispered, his voice taking on an almost reverent quality. "This is our moment, Aldrich. I've spent months studying you, learning every detail of your beautiful, ordered life. Your morning coffee routine, the way you check weather reports twice before each shift, how you always kiss Cordelia goodbye at exactly 7:45. His eyes gleamed with obsessive fervor. "You represent everything I've ever wanted: stability, respect, a place in a community that matters. You're insane. Aldrich backed toward the harbor master's office, calculating distances to potential weapons or escape routes. Insane? Gideon's laugh echoed off the water. I'm dedicated. Do you know what it's like to drift between communities, always watching from the outside? In Juneau, I tried to connect with Davies, but he didn't understand. He called the police before I could show him how perfect we could be together. Ketchikan was the same. Fear instead of gratitude. Gideon pulled out a knife, its blade reflecting the port's security lights. But you're different, Aldrich. You're going to appreciate what I've built for us. Aldrich grabbed a boat hook from the nearby equipment rack, the aluminum pole extending between them. Stay back. My wife knows where I am. Cordelia is watching television in your apartment, brewing her evening tea, Gideon interrupted, consulting his tablet with his free hand. She'll wait until 10:30 before worrying, giving us plenty of time for our conversation. The revelation that Gideon was monitoring Cordelia in real time sent rage surging through Aldrich's veins. He swung the boat hook in a wide arc, catching Gideon across the shoulder and sending him stumbling backward toward the dock's edge. You've been watching my wife, Aldrich roared, advancing with the pole raised. Violating our home! Gideon recovered quickly, lunging forward with the knife. Aldrich deflected the attack, but the blade sliced through his jacket sleeve, drawing blood. They grappled near the fuel pumps, Gideon's obsessive strength matching Aldrich's desperation to protect his family. You don't understand, Gideon panted as they struggled. I'm trying to preserve something beautiful. Your life, your marriage. I want to be part of it, to keep it safe forever. The other coordinators, they fought the connection. But you're going to accept me. Aldrich drove his knee into Gideon's ribs, breaking free long enough to activate the port's emergency alarm. Sirens wailed across the water, but help was hours away in the isolated community. Cordelia! Gideon screamed, his composure finally cracking. She's alone up there, 14 floors above us, making her tea, completely unaware that everything's changing. The threat to his wife triggered something primal in Aldrich. He brought the boat hook down hard across Gideon's wrist, sending the knife spinning into the dark water. Then he drove the metal pole into Gideon's chest, pinning him against the fuel station. You will never touch my family, Aldrich growled, his face inches from Gideon's. Never. Gideon's eyes filled with tears of rage and disappointment. You're destroying something perfect, he whispered. We could have been eternal. Alaska State Trooper Caspian Holloway arrived 90 minutes later to find Gideon zip-tied to the fuel pump with marine rope, unconscious but breathing. The subsequent investigation revealed a network of surveillance equipment throughout Whittier, detailed psychological profiles of 17 families, and journals describing Gideon's belief that he could preserve perfect moments by inserting himself into other people's lives permanently. The trial revealed that Gideon had killed 2 previous targets who rejected the connection. Aldrich's willingness to fight had saved not just his own life, but Cordelia's as well. Months later, Aldrich still worked the port, but now he carried a radio at all times. The windows of apartment 14C remained curtained, and every new face received careful scrutiny. In Whittier's isolation, survival meant vigilance, and the courage to fight when watching was no longer enough.